Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. I would bet many of you have an image similar to this one here. So this image here was taken in the late afternoon when the sun is, sitting low in the sky. It's sitting low enough to where we get this nice directional side light coming here from the left side of the frame. The sun is not directly overhead, like, blasting light downward, as it would in the middle of the day. And so, the direction of light is nice. It's at least a little bit softer than it would be midday. Nice highlights. There's good tonal information down here in the shadow region as well. So it's not completely blown out. It's not completely a lost cause, but the light isn't quite optimal. So what do we do about this? Well, I would bet if I were to conduct a poll right now and ask you what you would do, I bet a fair number of you would do the following. You would grab the highlight slider and push this down and to the left in order to compress the highlights and reveal more detail and color in the sky, more detail in the rock face here. If I toggle the before and after, you can see just, the impact it's having. This is the beauty of digital raw photo editing. We're able to do things like this. And then the next thing you might do is raise the shadows in order to bring out more detail and texture in the bottom half of the frame and just help equalize the tones, help soften out, make a more gradual roll off in your image, more gradual tonal roll off from the brightest areas to the darkest areas, just to make it a little less harsh and a little less contrasty. So we've recovered detail, we have compressed the tonal range, the image is starting to look better, but obviously there's something a little bit weird about it. Like the tones still aren't quite right. It's still, now that we've compressed the tones and pushed them further in, ironically, the image is now lacking contrast because, we started with contrast. We had, plenty of contrast at the beginning. We had these bright whites here and these darker areas here. But by recovering that detail in the highlights and the shadows, we have lost that punch. So what do we do about this? Well, I bet some of you would say, well, you just need to use the contrast slider, right? Up here at the top of the basic panel, you may start raising this up in order to return some contrast to the image again. But notice what's happening here. If we take a look at the highlights here, if we toggle back and forth between the before and the after, notice how we're losing detail. All the detail that we brought back by dropping that highlight slider has practically disappeared because contrast has pushed those highlights further up towards white. Similar thing with some of these darks. Some of these darks down here, especially like in this pool right here, they're starting to get kind of gummed up and they're getting blacker and we're losing detail and information down in there. And also there's a weird kind of like thing happening with the color, like in like this rock here, that just, it doesn't look particularly good. And that's because that contrast slider has a tendency to boost color saturation and everything starts to look a little more digital and a little more synthetic. It doesn't look particularly natural. So let's undo that contrast slider. Let's get rid of that. One of the tools you can try using is the Dehaze tool. Now, you may not think of this at first, but used sparingly, like, you just add just a little bit, it does a pretty good job of pushing down and darkening some of those darker midtones in the image, and also retrieving a little more detail in the highlights and making them look a little bit richer, increasing the contrast of the image in a way that is definitely more pleasing and in a way that helps protect the shadows and the black point in your image. And I think the best way to visualize what it's doing is to take a look at a grayscale ramp. So let's, increase dehaze and notice what it's doing. Notice how, pay attention to the darkest tones down here at the bottom end of the tonal range. You'll see that they're moving a little bit, but they're not moving that much. I mean, there's barely any change there, while most of that darkening effect is happening in the midtones and on the darker mids, and it's just increasing the contrast in those regions while also dampening the highlights just a little bit. That is definitely better than adding contrast, which, as you can see, the shadows start to roll off into black, and yeah, we start losing detail down there. Now, the one thing that I don't like about the Dehaze tool, the thing that I don't care for, is that Dehaze does have a tendency to oversaturate colors. Notice how the sky up here is getting very, kind of purple, and the blues are starting to, really, ramp up a little bit. And this is just with a small adjustment. Like if I keep going, it starts getting really bad. And, I mean, this is just how the tool is designed. I mean, it's designed to help return some color saturation to areas of the image that have atmospheric haze, that typically have low saturation. So it's trying to boost the color in those areas. But I could definitely do without that extra punch of color. Okay, let's try something else now. Another thing you might try using is come down here to the tone curve. And up here at the top of the panel, click on parametric curve if not currently selected. You might have the tone curve view, which looks similar, but if you see that, just click on the parametric option there. And then down here at the bottom of the panel, you will see 4 regions. We have highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. I am a pretty big fan of this darks region slider. Oftentimes when I'm nearing the end of an edit and I feel like the image just needs a little more punch in the contrast, like I just made things a little too soft, I'll just come in here to the parametric curve panel and just drop the darks down. And the reason it works so well is because, if you take a look at the graph up here above, most of the effect is applied to those darker mids. They're kind of like just to the left of middle gray in the image. And then the effect is tapered off down towards the blacks, and it also tapers off up towards the highlights too. So there's a very smooth roll off, and most of that darkening happens in the area where we need it most, which is the darker midtones. We definitely do not need to be darkening our darkest shadows. We just need to bring down those mids a little bit. Another option you have for brightening your midtones a little bit, come down here to the color grading panel, click on the midtones, and this is primarily intended for adding tone to an image, adding some color into it. But each one of these tones, the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights, they all have a luminance slider. And we can use this luminance slider here in order to bring some additional lift to our mids. This just essentially brightens the midtones and brings a little more life into those areas. Okay, let me undo all of that. And let's see, I gotta undo this. Oh, and by the way, I should actually point out that this image is an excellent example of an image that would benefit from clarity, from this clarity slider here, just above Dehaze, because clarity adds structure to the image. It helps reveal some of the underlying textures and patterns in the image. Notice what's happening. Like now we're beginning to see more of the lines, more of the underlying structure in the shadows here. And yes, it may be getting a little much in these highlights up here because they didn't really need it. But down here in the foreground, it definitely helps. Any image that you have where the midtones just feel a little vague, a little flat, and lacking in definition, and you need to create more definition, try using the clarity slider. And if you don't want to apply it globally, you can always apply it with a brush or with a mask. Then another option you have, obviously, is to use the tone curve. If you've never used the tone curve before, this is a great opportunity to do so. This is a good time to learn it because it is a very powerful tool. Put a midpoint right in the middle just by clicking on it, and then just kind of, move this around a little bit and, try to figure out where you want middle gray to be, where you want the midpoint to sit. And then you can add, another control point here, and maybe pull this down a little bit and focus it, keep this control point close to middle gray. And if you do, then the effect will be gently tapered off towards your blacks, and you'll get, more contrast, more punch where you need it. Okay, so obviously there are, a number of different ways that you can add contrast to an image in Lightroom, add additional depth and dimension to an image, create more visual separation between the tones in your shot that do not involve using that contrast slider at the top of the develop panel. And generally speaking, I try to do as much editing in Lightroom as I possibly can because Lightroom is obviously a raw editor and it's a non-destructive editor and it's much easier to undo changes there. But I think at the end of the day, the tool that provides the best results, the most natural results when applying contrast, the one that gives you even more control is, of course, Photoshop. It's my preferred place to be doing finishing touches like these, and I'll be showing you a number of different things that you can do. Before we jump into Photoshop though, I just want to take a moment and say thank you to those of you out there who kindly supported this new photography zine that I put together. I printed 150 copies of it, and much to my surprise, it sold out in just over 24 hours. And I was shocked. I mean, to say the least, I was very, very surprised. the easiest part of this, the part that took the least amount of time, the part that I thought was going to take a lot of time, ended up taking no time at all. And that was setting up, an online, storefront with a product page where I could sell it. It took me maybe 45 minutes to do. And the reason why it was super easy to do is because I published my website using Squarespace. I like using Squarespace for publishing my photos online because their templates are very clean and simple, and I think they're just particularly well suited for viewing images. And I also love the fact that I don't have to worry about mobile. Web pages look great on mobile as well. Even though I definitely know how to code and how to design and build a website, I prefer using Squarespace because it is so simple and straightforward and easy to use. And it's just one less thing for me to think about. It's so easy just to publish new images and to, start selling items like these. It's super simple. So if you are looking to build a brand new website, or maybe refresh the one that you currently have, if you have an old website that could use a refresh, definitely check out Squarespace. And you can do so absolutely free for 30 days. Kick the tires and see how it works for you by heading over to squarespace.com/Dominey. And then when you're ready to go live with your new site or register a new domain, use my last name, Dominey, to save 10% off your purchase. And I'm going to begin here with the simplest and easiest thing to do. It's so ridiculously easy. All you do is come over here to the adjustments panel, add a curves adjustment layer. Don't even need to edit it. Don't touch it. Don't do anything. Just go to the blend mode and change it to soft light. Now, the way this works is that the soft light blend mode has its own intrinsic tonal curve that's built into the blend mode. And that's why just by having a just perfectly linear, non-edited tone curve added to the image, the effect of that soft light blend mode is coming through. And so we are, lifting the bright midtones, we are darkening the darker midtones, and we are creating just some nice contrast in the image here, without adversely affecting our brightest whites or adversely affecting the darkest blacks in the image. Now we can, of course, come up here to the opacity property here, and we can, raise this up and down if we want, control how much contrast we want. We can certainly do that. Another thing you can do is change the blend mode from soft light to overlay. If you want even more punch, soft light is basically like a softer version of overlay. And here you get more of that contrast punch in the image. But, again, you can come up to opacity and just dial this in and suit it to taste. Okay, but let's get a little more nuanced here. So I'm gonna switch this back over here to overlay and keep the opacity at 100% so it's easy to see. And now we are going to blend this change in more selectively into our image. And we can do that by double clicking on an empty area in the layer. And then down here at the bottom, you'll see this blend if section. Now this section down here controls how this layer is blended into the one directly underneath. So what you want to do is come down here to underlying layer, and you want to hold down the Option key on a Mac, or I think that's Alt on Windows. Select the right side of this little arrow here, and you want to break it apart and pull this over. So now we are feathering this effect, and we are controlling where in the shadows this curves adjustment layer is being applied. So if, for example, we're a little concerned about this dark pool of water here, we can lift this up until we see that return to a good brightness level. And then we can do the same with the highlights, and we can break this apart again with the Option key or Alt on Windows and bring this down from the right side so we are not adversely affecting our highlights. And so now we have contrast that is more tailored, that is more, specifically applied to particular tonal regions while still protecting our shadows and our highlights. Okay, another clever thing that we can do with the curves adjustment layer. Let me put this back on, and I'm going to set the blend mode to soft light. So before I said that you don't need to touch the tone curve, and that's true if you just want that effect to be uniformly applied across the entire image from black to white. And if that works, great, but you can also come in here and adjust the tone curve to more selectively control where that contrast is being applied. So for example, if I feel like the blacks are getting a little bit gummed up, I can just lift up the black point like so. And if I feel like it's reaching too much into the highlights, I can drop the white point and compress it more towards the midtones again in the image. And so now the contrast is mainly being applied to the dark mids and the bright mids. And notice here that the white point does not change because the curves adjustment layer has a soft light blend mode assigned to it, which makes this curve function differently when changing the white point and the black point compared to a normal blend mode. And if I toggle this on and off, you can see that the highlights really don't move that much. I mean, they stay pretty much where they are. And the darkest pixels in the image aren't moving too much either. They're moving a little bit. There's a little bit of a fade there. So we could, bring this back down a little bit and then give it just a little bit of a boost down here in the shadows, just to bring that up a little bit. Maybe bring down the white point some. And so, yeah, I think right about there. Okay, so what I just showed you is obviously something that anyone can do out of the box with Photoshop. You don't need any special plugins or anything like that. But now I'm going to show you a plugin called TK Actions, which is a luminosity mask plugin, kind of like a Swiss Army knife for Photoshop. It's got a bunch of different functions in it. I made a video about this a while back of like my favorite things in TK Actions. If you're interested, I'll put it up there. I use it all the time. And once you start using it, it's kind of hard to use Photoshop without it, I think. So check that out and also link to it down below in the video description if interested. So TK Actions is a luminosity mask plugin, but it's got, it's got a bunch of other shortcuts and a bunch of other actions in here. And yes, it looks rather intimidating, but I promise you it's not once you, because these are all things that you'll recognize from Photoshop. These are just, these are just shortcuts to access them. This is really the meat and potatoes of TK Action down here. This is where you're able to create luminosity masks that select a very specific tonal region of the image. It's kind of like, the old Ansel Adams zone system where you're able to, click through here and select a specific zone, like whichever one it is that you want to edit. And like any mask, white reveals, black conceals. Okay, so that's generally what a luminosity mask is, and we can use them to be very, very precise with our adjustments. And one of the easiest ways that works surprisingly well to add soft contrast to the midtones in an image is just to click on the midtones mask here. And you could do 2, you could do 1 or 3, but I like to do 2 generally. And so now the mask that we have here is mostly selecting the midtones in the image, and the darker areas are not selected. But you can see there's a fair amount of feathering going on here so that the effect and the change looks natural. Okay, then I'm going to output this mask to a curves adjustment layer, similar to what we did earlier. Now we have a curves adjustment layer over here with the with that midtone mask applied to it. And again, similar to what we did earlier, I'm going to come up here to the blend mode and then change this to soft light. Now, because this is focused just purely on the midtones, like, that is all it's selecting. Let me actually generate that mask again so we can take a look at the histogram here. Notice how, the data is being selected here in the image. It is selecting everything that is directly to the left of middle gray and then tapers off towards the end here. So it's primarily focusing our attention right where we want it. And that is why we get this very soft, very nice little extra bit of contrast in the image that does not adversely affect the highlights or the shadows. It looks very nice and very natural. Now, again, we can set this to overlay if we want just a little more punch, and we can, come up and adjust the black point and the white point like we did earlier. But if you want something that's, just a little more tailored, a little more targeted towards those midtones, using a luminosity mask is a fantastic way to do it. And I think the TK Actions panel is definitely worth checking out if interested. Okay, in addition to overlay and soft light, another blend mode I would recommend experimenting with is luminosity. If you've never tried luminosity before, luminosity adjusts the tonal values in your image, but without affecting color. So usually when you add contrast to an image, as you may know, colors have a tendency to get richer and deeper, which is sometimes a negative thing. But if you don't want to affect color at all and you just want to affect tonal values, you can change this over to luminosity and then make some adjustments to your tone curve here to be lifting and lowering tonal values in your image. Now, this can get a little bit weird. Like sometimes it works really well and sometimes it just looks a little bit odd because, especially if you're accustomed to colors changing and getting deeper and richer or brighter and more vibrant when adjusting contrast. But as you can see with the luminosity blend mode, it's getting brighter and darker, but the color isn't changing. Now, this isn't right for every image, but it could be with certain ones. So that is another blend mode to, experiment with if you've never done so before. So we started with this rather contrasty, straight out of camera, raw image here. Then we dropped the highlights and lifted the shadows in Lightroom to recover detail and to help balance the tonality. We then brought contrast back to the image by using the contrast slider in Lightroom, which didn't look very good, so we got rid of that. Then contrast was brought back using Photoshop, with targeted contrast applied primarily to the midtones of the image, where contrast was most needed after that highlights and shadows adjustment, and not to the darkest shadows and not to the brightest highlights. Still plenty more editing that could be done to this image, but I feel like this is a good baseline to start working with. Okay, so those are my tips and recommendations for being more selective, more targeted with your contrast adjustments in your raw images, as opposed to just applying a blanket contrast adjustment across everything. So my recommendation to you, if what you saw in this video is new to you, put it to use with your own photography. Give it a try, experiment with it when you have some free time, and try out some of the different things that I talked about and see how they work for you. See how you like them and get comfortable with them, because I do think that they'll make a difference once you get beyond just applying standard contrast to an image and you learn how to be more nuanced with it. I think you're going to be happier with the results that you get. If this video was helpful, do me a favor and give this video a thumbs up down below, and maybe even leave a comment down there while you're at it. And also, speaking of comments, if you have your own tip, your own technique, something that works well for you when applying contrast, let me know, and let other people know by leaving a comment down below, and tell us what it is that you're doing. Would love to know more, and I'm sure other people would as well. That's it from me, everyone. Remember to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. And that's it. I'll see you next time.